Welcome to Sunday Scares, where the shadows whisper and nightmares come to life. But did you know that 99% of you watching aren't subscribed? If you love chilling tales that keep you up at night, hit like to feed the darkness, and subscribe if you dare. Now turn off the lights, settle in, and let the horror begin. The air in the jungle was thick with humidity, clinging to their skin like a second layer, as Lily and Ben trudged through the dense undergrowth. They had been walking for hours, and every step felt like an eternity. They had come to South America for adventure, seeking to discover the untouched corners of the world. And they had found themselves in one of the wildest regions of the Amazon rainforest. The river they'd crossed earlier had been the last marker they needed, taking them further into the wilderness where few, if any, had ventured. The village they were searching for was supposed to be on the other side of the river, nestled between the jagged hills and thick foliage. Its inhabitants, according to their research, had been isolated from the rest of the world for centuries, uncontacted by modern civilization. The thought of finding such a place thrilled Ben. He was the adventurer, the one who lived for the thrill of discovery. Lily, on the other hand, was more cautious. She had always been skeptical, unsure of the risks, but she had come along, hoping to make memories, to share in Ben's excitement. After what seemed like an endless march, they reached the river. The water was fast-moving, churning over rocks and rushing toward the distant ocean. The boatman, an old local they had hired to take them across, had already docked on the other side and was anxiously waving them over. "Better hurry," the old man muttered under his breath as Lily and Ben scrambled down the embankment. His eyes flicked nervously to the jungle across the river. "There's not much time." Ben glanced at him, unsure of his meaning but too eager to delay. "We'll be fine," he said, brushing aside the old man's warnings. They boarded the boat, and the old man ferried them across. The moment their feet touched the other shore, the air felt different, denser, more oppressive. The jungle felt like it was closing in, as if it had a life of its own. It didn't take long before they reached the village. The huts were unlike anything they had ever seen, constructed from mud and thatch, blending seamlessly with the natural surroundings. It was an eerie scene. There were no sounds of animals, no bustling village life, just the soft whisper of the wind through the trees and the occasional flutter of bird wings. The inhabitants watched from the shadows, their eyes dark and unreadable. Lily felt a chill crawl down her spine. She had expected the village to be thriving, to be full of life. Instead, it was silent. Ben, however, was excited. He reached for the bag of offerings he had prepared, a handful of bright beads, a few small trinkets, and an ancient, hand-carved spear that he had brought for the chief. "Let's give them these," Ben said, showing the items to Lily, his eyes wide with anticipation. "A peace offering. This is going to be amazing." Lily didn't share his enthusiasm. The tribe had seen no outsiders in years, maybe longer, and Ben thought a few trinkets would smooth everything over. She felt a sense of dread settling in the pit of her stomach. The tribe's eyes, those dark, unblinking eyes, watched them closely. The people were silent, not moving an inch, standing like statues as if they were waiting for something. They were standing on the outskirts of the village now, and Lily turned to Ben. "Maybe we should go back," she whispered. "I don't like the way they're looking at us." Ben shook his head. "No, we've come this far. They'll accept the gifts, and then we'll get what we came for, a glimpse into their world. Trust me." Reluctantly, Lily nodded. Together they stepped forward, walking towards the center of the village. The air grew colder as they moved, the heat from the jungle now feeling more stifling. When they reached the central fire pit, the villagers remained motionless. Ben took a deep breath and began to lay the offerings before them. "We come in peace," he said, his voice steady, but not as confident as he had hoped. "We mean no harm." The village chief, an imposing figure with a dark tattooed face, stepped forward. His eyes, deep and fathomless, locked with Ben's. The chief reached for the beads and trinkets, then threw them to the ground. His expression did not change. Lily's heart skipped a beat. Ben's face fell, a flicker of doubt crossing his features. He had expected a different reaction, but the chief's gaze never wavered. The villagers remained still, unblinking, as if they were waiting for something more. A tense silence hung in the air. We thought you might appreciate these gifts," Ben said, his voice faltering now. "We've come from far away to learn about your people, your way of life." The chief didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached for a wooden whistle hanging from his neck and blew into it. The sharp sound cut through the air, and before either of them could react, figures emerged from the trees. They moved quickly, silently, their faces painted with white and red markings. Their presence was unnerving, their sudden appearance adding to the growing sense of fear that was settling deep in Lily's chest. The chief stood motionless as the others began circling around Ben and Lily, their eyes burning with suspicion. The air felt thick with tension, and Lily instinctively took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. "Ben," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's wrong." Ben turned, meeting her gaze. The unease in her eyes mirrored his own growing doubt. The tribe had not accepted their peace offering. They had been met with cold indifference. The chief lifted his hand, signaling for the villagers to stop. He looked at them both, his eyes narrowing. Then, with a voice that was low and guttural, he spoke in a language they couldn't understand. It sounded ancient, guttural, and it made Lily's skin crawl. The words weren't inviting. They were a warning. Without thinking, Ben stepped back, raising his hands in an attempt to show that they meant no harm. "We meant no disrespect," he said, his voice rising in panic. "We just wanted to understand." But it was too late. With terrifying speed, the villagers closed in, moving faster than humanly possible. Ben grabbed Lily's arm, pulling her toward the edge of the village. The sounds of chants and footsteps filled the air, their pursuit relentless. The jungle around them seemed to come alive, the trees creaking and groaning as though they were closing in, cutting off their escape. Lily's breath quickened, and she stumbled over a root, falling to the ground. Ben pulled her up, his panic rising as the sounds of the villagers grew louder, closer. They reached the river, breathless and desperate. But the boatman was gone. The old man had disappeared, leaving them stranded on the far side of the jungle, surrounded by hostile forces. "We have to swim," Ben gasped, dragging Lily toward the water. But the current was strong, and the water churned as if it was fighting them. Suddenly, there was a loud whistle, and the villagers emerged from the jungle, blocking their way. They were armed now, carrying spears, their faces etched with fury. The chief stood at the forefront, watching them with cold, calculating eyes. Ben looked at Lily, his eyes wide with terror. "We can't fight them," he whispered. "We need to cross the river, but we're trapped." As the chief raised his hand, signaling for the attack, the whistle echoed once more, this time from behind them. The villagers froze, their attention shifting toward the far bank. Lily's heart raced as the sound of footsteps approached. They were coming for them. But this time it wasn't the villagers. Out of the shadows emerged another figure. A man, dressed in tattered clothing, his face weathered and worn. He held a large curved knife in his hand. As the chief saw him, his expression faltered, and the villagers slowly lowered their weapons. The man spoke in a language they didn't understand, but it was clear from his tone that he wasn't welcome. The chief's face darkened, and after a tense moment, the villagers parted, allowing the man to approach. Lily and Ben watched, horrified as the man reached them. "They are not your enemies," he said in broken English, "but you cannot stay here. The river is the boundary. You must leave." The chief, who had been silent, now spoke once more. The words were harsh and quick, and the man shook his head. "Peace offerings mean nothing here. You have trespassed. You must leave now." Lily and Ben didn't need any more convincing. They turned, running back toward the river, their hearts pounding in their chests. The jungle no longer seemed like a place of adventure. It was a prison, and the tribe's silent watch was the key to their escape. They dove into the river, the strong current pushing them downstream. Behind them, the distant whistle echoed once more, but they didn't look back. They had been given a chance, only just. Lily and Ben fought against the current as the river swallowed them whole. The water surged around them, relentless, but it was their only hope. Every stroke felt like an eternity as they struggled to move against the powerful flow, their legs burning with exertion. The jungle, once so welcoming and filled with promise, now seemed to have a life of its own, actively trying to prevent their escape. As they pushed through the water, the distant sounds of the villagers' whistles echoed across the riverbank, a reminder of how close they were to being caught. Lily's breathing was ragged, her chest tight, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let go. They couldn't afford to stop, not until they were safely on the other side. Ben was ahead of her, his arms slicing through the water with desperate urgency, but his eyes kept flicking back over his shoulder, scanning for any sign of movement from the jungle. The shadows of the trees, so thick and imposing, seemed to watch them from the other side, waiting, lurking. "Come on," Ben shouted, his voice strained. "We're almost there." Lily's limbs felt like lead, but the sight of the distant riverbank gave her the strength to keep going. Her feet brushed against something jagged beneath the water, and she cried out in pain, but she didn't stop. Not yet. Finally, with one last desperate push, they both made it to the far side of the river. They collapsed on the muddy bank, gasping for air, the cool night air sharp against their wet skin. The jungle was quieter now, almost eerily so, but they didn't dare relax. Ben staggered to his feet first, pulling Lily up with him. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse, his eyes wide with panic. "They could follow us." Lily nodded, too terrified to speak. She was aware of the dangers around them, but her mind kept flashing back to what they had left behind. The eerie, silent faces of the villagers, their cold eyes watching them like they were mere intruders, animals to be hunted. They moved quickly, stumbling through the underbrush, their ears straining for any sound. But the jungle, too, seemed to be holding its breath. The only sound was the rush of the river behind them and the beating of their hearts in their chests. Suddenly, Ben froze. His hand shot out to stop Lily, and he raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Lily's breath hitched as she strained her ears. There, faint but distinct, was the sound of something in the jungle, something moving. The unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. A low, guttural whistle, followed by the soft sound of branches snapping. "They're coming," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "We have to move faster." Without another word, they turned and ran, their hearts hammering in their chests. The shadows seemed to press in from all sides as the dense foliage closed around them. They couldn't see the pursuers, but they could feel them. There was no mistaking the sensation of being watched, of being hunted. Minutes stretched into hours as they scrambled through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between themselves and the village. The jungle was endless, and the more they ran, the more it seemed to trap them. Every direction felt the same: trees, vines, and more trees. The darkness of the night felt suffocating, and every rustle in the leaves sent waves of panic through their bodies. Lily stumbled again, her foot catching on a vine, and she fell to the ground. Ben stopped immediately, reaching down to pull her up. "We can't stop," he said, his voice laced with panic. "They're right behind us." Lily's breath came in sharp gasps. "Ben, we need to think. We can't just run forever." Ben's gaze flicked to the river behind them, then to the thick canopy of the jungle ahead. He knew they couldn't keep going like this. They had to find shelter, some way to hide, or they were doomed. But the jungle seemed to offer no sanctuary, only the oppressive silence, broken by the occasional whisper of a branch, or a faint whistle that chilled them to the bone. Then, out of nowhere, they heard it. A voice, low, guttural, and familiar. It was a sound that froze them in place, making their blood run cold. The voice was speaking in the language of the tribe. It wasn't a call for help or a warning. It was something far worse. A chant, almost ritualistic, that sent an icy shiver down their spines. Lily's mind raced. They're performing some kind of ceremony," she said, her voice shaking. Ben swallowed hard, his face pale. "We need to get out of here, now." They took off again, moving with whatever energy they had left. But the voice kept getting louder, the chanting growing more intense, more rhythmic. The pursuit was relentless, the tribe never far behind. Ben could feel the brush of leaves against his face, the sting of branches as they tore at his skin. But the jungle was no longer an ally. It was a maze that seemed designed to trap them, to force them deeper into its heart. Suddenly they reached a clearing, and in the center was an old, rotting tree stump. It looked ancient, like something out of a nightmare. Ben stopped, grabbing Lily's arm. "This way," he whispered, his eyes wide with fear. He pushed her toward the stump, and they crouched down behind it, trying to make themselves as small as possible. They held their breath, listening for any sounds that might give away their position. The chanting grew louder, closer now. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. He could hear footsteps now, rhythmic, deliberate, getting closer and closer. His mind raced. They couldn't stay hidden forever. Just as Ben thought he couldn't take another second of the growing tension, the jungle erupted into chaos. A roar, primal and filled with rage, echoed through the clearing, causing the earth beneath them to vibrate. The villagers, caught off guard by whatever had made the sound, paused. The chanting stopped abruptly, and all that was left was the unnerving silence. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the shadows, a massive shadowed form that towered over them. It wasn't human, not fully. It was something else, something they couldn't comprehend. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and its mouth opened wide in a soundless scream. The creature moved with terrifying speed, darting through the trees, vanishing into the night as quickly as it had appeared. The villagers scattered, retreating into the jungle with unnatural speed, as if the very sight of the creature had broken their resolve. Ben and Lily were left alone in the clearing, shaken and breathless, but alive. It was then that they realized the jungle was no longer the only thing hunting them. There was something else, something older, something far darker. The peace offering had been refused, but the jungle had decided to pass its own judgment. Ben and Lily didn't wait to find out what came next. They ran, faster than they ever had before, the sound of the jungle swallowing them whole. They would never speak of the river of silence again, nor of the tribe that lived on the other side. The Amazon jungle was more than just a backdrop to Sam and Elisa's adventure. It was a living, breathing entity, its dense canopy blocking out the sun, its humid air thick with the weight of unseen creatures, and its silence broken only by the occasional, haunting call of an animal. They had come to explore its depths, to document the lost secrets, of an uncontacted tribe, but something about the jungle had begun to unsettle them, even in the first few hours. Sam wiped the sweat from his brow as he surveyed the tangled mass of green. The thick vegetation pressed in from all sides, the trees towering above like ancient sentinels. Elisa, a few paces behind, was checking her GPS, her brow furrowed in concentration. The device had been erratic ever since they'd entered the heart of the jungle, and now it seemed to be pointing in circles. "I think we're lost," Elisa muttered, her voice strained with frustration. "The GPS is useless here." Sam didn't answer immediately. He'd suspected as much when they crossed the last river, but he hadn't wanted to admit it. The Amazon was a place that swirled with mystery, a place where things didn't always make sense. "I'll set up camp," Sam said, trying to keep his tone casual. He wasn't sure if it was the oppressive heat or the creeping sense of isolation, but something about the jungle felt wrong. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." They cleared a small patch of ground and set up their tent, the air thick with the buzzing of insects and the occasional screech of unseen birds. As night fell, the jungle seemed to grow more oppressive, the darkness heavier. The air grew colder, a strange shift from the sweltering heat of the day. Around the campfire, the crackling flames cast long, wavering shadows across the forest floor. Sam glanced over at Elisa, whose eyes darted nervously into the dark. "You okay?" he asked, leaning back against a log. Elisa didn't answer right away. She pulled her knees closer to her chest and hugged her arms around her legs. "I don't know. It's too quiet, you know?" Sam nodded. He knew exactly what she meant. The jungle, despite its outward cacophony of animal sounds, had an eerie silence in the moments that followed dusk. The usual calls of monkeys and birds were absent, replaced by a strange, oppressive stillness. The occasional rustling of leaves was the only indication that they weren't completely alone. And then there was the sound. A low guttural call, barely audible over the wind, echoed through the trees. It was impossible to place the source, but it seemed to resonate from all directions. Elisa stiffened at the sound, her eyes wide with alarm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Sam was already on his feet, straining to listen. The noise came again, this time louder, a throaty growl followed by a high-pitched whistle. It sounded almost like an animal, too guttural to be human, but unmistakably deliberate. It was closer now, coming from the north. "Maybe it's an animal," Sam said, trying to calm her. But even as he spoke, he felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "Maybe," Elisa whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. They stood there for a moment, listening. The growl came again, but this time it was joined by another, this one from the east, and then another from the west. The calls surrounded them, closing in like the tightening of a noose. "What the hell?" Sam muttered, his pulse quickening. He glanced around the campfire, the flickering light casting long, uncertain shadows. "I don't like this." Elisa took a step toward him, her face pale. "We're not alone." They both heard it then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light and quick, crunching through the underbrush. But there was no animal in sight, no rustling in the bushes. The footsteps stopped abruptly. "What is it?" Elisa whispered, clutching Sam's arm. Sam shook his head. He was sure they weren't imagining it. The footsteps had been too real, too distinct. But when he looked around, the jungle remained silent. No movement, no signs of life. "I'll check it out," Sam said, grabbing his machete. He moved toward the edge of their camp, every step feeling heavier than the last. The jungle was thick with shadows, and the wind had died down, leaving an oppressive stillness in its wake. As he moved further from the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. The jungle had always had a way of making him feel small, insignificant. But tonight, the weight of its ancient presence seemed unbearable. "Elisa, stay here," Sam called over his shoulder, though he wasn't sure why he was even saying it. It was as though the jungle had drawn them into its depths, its invisible hands keeping them tethered to something they couldn't comprehend. He moved deeper into the jungle, the faint sound of whispers in the leaves now mingling with the unsettling animal calls. He pushed through the foliage, machete slicing through the thick vines that threatened to entangle him. His eyes scanned the darkness ahead, trying to make out any movement, any hint of danger. And then, for a split second, he saw it. A figure, hunched and cloaked in shadow, standing between two trees. It was tall, impossibly still, with no discernible features. It looked like a person, but something was off. Its limbs were too long, its posture too unnatural. The moment Sam's eyes locked onto it, the figure dissolved into the shadows, as though it had never been there. Sam froze, his heart hammering in his chest. He couldn't explain what he had seen, but he felt an overwhelming urge to get back to the camp. Quickly. "Elisa!" Sam shouted as he turned and ran back toward the tent. He found her sitting by the campfire, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She didn't look at him at first, her gaze fixed on something beyond him, something in the darkness. "Elisa?" Sam asked, his voice tight with concern. She slowly turned her head toward him, her face twisted with terror. "They're coming." Sam's stomach sank. He could hear the distant growls again, and this time they were closer, louder, more distinct. He glanced into the dark jungle beyond the firelight, feeling the oppressive weight of the unseen eyes staring at him. A sudden, sharp cry cut through the air, sending a shiver down Sam's spine. It was a scream, but not human. Something primal and guttural. The sound of an animal in pain. The noise was followed by a strange, eerie whistle, like a signal. Then, the jungle came alive. From all sides, shapes moved in the shadows. Figures too quick to see clearly, too silent to hear until they were already close. Sam's breath caught in his throat as he grabbed Elisa's arm. "We need to go now," he hissed. They bolted into the jungle, running blindly through the dense undergrowth. The calls, the whistles, and the growls surrounded them, growing louder with each passing second. It felt as if the jungle itself had come alive, the trees and vines moving in response to the eerie music of the tribe that stalked them. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the calls stopped. Sam and Elisa slowed to a halt, panting, their hearts thundering in their chests. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. The jungle had swallowed them whole, leaving them with only the oppressive stillness and the knowledge that they were not alone. And they were being hunted. Sam and Elisa stood in the dense undergrowth, their breaths shallow and frantic, straining to listen. The oppressive silence of the jungle was suffocating, broken only by the erratic beating of their hearts. The darkness around them felt alive, watching, waiting. The faint rustle of leaves, the distant snap of a twig, but no sounds that could confirm their pursuers were still near. Sam felt a tremor run through his body as he glanced over at Elisa. Her face was drawn tight with fear, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow, as if expecting the jungle to come crashing down around them at any moment. What is happening, Sam?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He swallowed hard, trying to gather his thoughts. The whispering in the trees had stopped, but the air around them felt charged, thick with an unnatural energy. "I don't know," Sam muttered, looking around the jungle. "But whatever it is, it's not human." Elisa's eyes locked onto him, wide with panic. "What do we do? They've been watching us since we got here." "I know it." Sam nodded slowly, feeling the weight of her words. Something had been off the moment they set foot in the jungle. The locals had warned them about the dangers of venturing too deep into the Amazon, about the hidden tribes that were never seen by outsiders. But Sam had brushed it off as superstition. Now it felt like that superstition was coming to life. Another whistle broke the silence, this one closer, much closer. It was high-pitched and sharp, cutting through the air like a predator's call. Then the unmistakable sound of feet moving swiftly through the jungle, silent but deliberate, followed by a snap of a twig underfoot. "They're close," Elisa said, her voice a whisper of dread. Sam grabbed her arm and pulled her toward a cluster of trees. "We have to keep moving. We need to find a place to hide." They moved through the dense jungle, trying to keep their movements as quiet as possible. The heat was unbearable, sweat running down their faces and backs, but it wasn't the physical exhaustion that had them trembling. It was the feeling that something, someone, was always just a step behind them. The calls came again, this time louder, synchronized. It was no longer just a random noise. It was deliberate, rhythmic. The hunters were communicating, drawing closer with every passing second. Sam's heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the shadows around them, looking for any sign of movement. But the jungle was still, too still. Suddenly, Elisa stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She gasped and fell forward, scraping her hands on the rough jungle floor. Sam reached out, pulling her back to her feet. "Stay close," he urged, his voice low and urgent. "Sam, I don't know how much longer I can keep running," Elisa said, her voice strained. "We can't stop," Sam replied, his eyes flicking nervously to the trees around them. "If we stop, we're dead." They pushed on, moving as quickly as they could, but the jungle seemed to close in on them. The sound of footsteps was behind them again, quick and sharp, always just out of sight. The air grew colder, a creeping chill that seemed to settle on their skin like an omen. Sam's mind raced as they moved deeper into the heart of the jungle. But the longer they ran, the more they felt the weight of being hunted. They weren't just running from their pursuers. They were running from something ancient, something they couldn't understand. The calls came again, this time closer, and then the unmistakable sound of something, someone, crashing through the underbrush behind them. Sam glanced back, his eyes wide with terror. "Elisa, run!" he shouted, but it was already too late. Something broke through the trees behind them, a shape moving so quickly it was almost a blur. Sam barely had time to register the shadowy figure before it was upon them. Elisa screamed as the figure lunged, grabbing her arm with an inhuman strength. "Let her go!" Sam shouted, his voice cracking with fear. He swung his machete at the figure, but it was like striking at air. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, melting into the shadows of the jungle. Elisa was breathless, her eyes wild with terror. "What was that? What the hell was that?" "I don't know," Sam whispered, his voice hoarse. "But it's not alone." The growls came then, low and guttural, echoing from all directions. The jungle came alive with noise as if the very trees were alive, shifting, moving with a will of their own. It wasn't just one creature. They were surrounded. The figures appeared again, too fast to track, too quiet to hear until they were already on them. Sam couldn't tell if they were human or something else. Shadowy, ghost-like figures that melted in and out of the trees, blending seamlessly with the jungle. They were closing in, their presence suffocating, as though the jungle itself had turned against them. Sam pulled Elisa behind him, his machete raised, but it felt like a futile gesture. The figures closed in, their eyes gleaming from the darkness. He could hear the soft whispers now, words in a language he didn't understand, words that seemed to vibrate through his skull. "Elisa, we need to move," Sam whispered, his voice tight with panic. "We can't stay here." But Elisa was frozen, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the figures emerging from the jungle. Sam grabbed her arm, shaking her. "We need to run. Now." They ran, their footsteps frantic and wild, crashing through the jungle, pushing through the thick undergrowth. But it felt like the jungle was closing in around them, its dense foliage swallowing them whole. The calls continued to echo in the distance, haunting, relentless, and impossibly close. They didn't stop running. Not until they reached the edge of the jungle and stumbled into a small clearing. Elisa collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, her chest heaving. Sam fell beside her, sweat pouring down his face, his heart racing in his chest. They were safe, at least for now. But as they looked back into the jungle, the shadows seemed to shift, to move, as if the jungle itself was alive, watching them. The figures were still out there, in the dark, waiting. Sam and Elisa had come to the Amazon to uncover secrets. But what they found, they were not prepared for. The jungle had claimed them, and now it would never let them go. The dense Amazon jungle was a living entity of its own, breathing in sync with the pulse of the earth. With every step, the air grew thicker, the humidity pressing against their skin as though the very atmosphere wanted to swallow them whole. Dr. Elena Ramirez, leading the research team, paused to wipe the sweat from her brow. She scanned the horizon, where the jungle stretched endlessly into the distance, dense foliage blurring into an impenetrable wall of green. Their objective was simple: gather data on the flora and fauna in this largely unexplored area. Yet something gnawed at her, a creeping unease that grew with each passing hour. "Ready to set up camp?" Carlos, the team's assistant, asked, breaking her thoughts. He stood holding the heavy pack over his shoulder, his face pale in the dimming light. "Yeah," Elena responded. "Let's just make sure the perimeter is clear first. We don't want to make any mistakes." The rest of the team busied themselves as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally across the jungle floor. By the time the fire was built, the air had cooled, and the buzzing insects gave way to the distant calls of jungle creatures. Yet, something was off. Elena couldn't quite place it, but the usual cacophony of night sounds felt muted. After a quick dinner, the team gathered around the fire. Elena's eyes kept flicking toward the dense undergrowth where every rustle of the leaves seemed too deliberate, too intentional. A branch snapped, sharp and sudden, followed by a low growl from the darkened jungle. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end, and she was suddenly aware of how isolated they were. The campfire cast long shadows, and the deep, unsettling silence that followed the noise made her stomach churn. "Did you hear that?" asked Marco, the youngest member of the team. He was a biologist, his hands always itching to collect specimens, but now his gaze darted nervously into the dark. Elena nodded. "Stay close. We don't want to make ourselves known. There are tribes around here. You know the rules." The team had been briefed extensively about the dangers of the jungle, but it was always in the back of their minds, the indigenous tribes that lived here, unknown and untouched by the modern world, who might see them as intruders. And there were the legends too, whispers of shadowy figures, silent and invisible, whose eyes glinted from the dark. Around the fire, the conversation died down. Everyone instinctively sat closer, their voices dropping to whispers. It was a rule they had followed religiously: do not make loud noises. The tribes were said to communicate in strange ways, through animal calls and worse, by mimicking the sounds of their prey. The darkness seemed to stretch impossibly long that night, with every rustle of the wind, every bird call, and every snap of a branch intensifying the fear that gnawed at the edges of their minds. Elena kept her gaze fixed on the shadows beyond the firelight, hoping it was just the jungle playing tricks. The jungle was far from silent, but tonight, the usual chorus of animal calls felt different. There was something off about it, unsettling. The air, thick with humidity, seemed to hum in a way that made Eleanor's skin crawl. Her team had settled into their camp just beyond a small clearing, the fire crackling fiercely, casting erratic shadows against the encroaching darkness. It had been a long day of setting up research equipment, collecting samples and documenting their surroundings. But despite the exhaustion, none of them seemed to be able to relax fully. Carlos was the first to notice it. He sat cross-legged on the ground, cleaning his gear by the firelight. He paused, his hands frozen in mid-motion. "Did you hear that?" His voice was low, almost hesitant. Elena looked up sharply, her senses on high alert. The jungle, once full of life, now seemed eerily quiet. The usual hum of cicadas, the distant calls of howler monkeys, and the rustling of leaves were gone. In their place was an unnatural stillness. A single call broke the silence. It was high-pitched, almost like a bird's screech, but the sound carried a strange, guttural quality to it. The call was unlike any animal noise they had heard before in the jungle. The others turned to look at Eleanor, their faces marked with the same confusion. "That's not right," Elena muttered, her instincts kicking into overdrive. Her hand instinctively went to the machete at her side, and her eyes scanned the tree line. But the shadows were too deep to see anything. The others, now clearly nervous, stood in uneasy silence, the tension palpable. "It's probably nothing," Carlos said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Could just be an animal we haven't heard before." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. The call was too deliberate, too purposeful. It didn't belong to any animal native to this part of the jungle. The locals had warned them about the tribes that lived deep in the Amazon, tribes that were wary of outsiders and would not hesitate to defend their territory if threatened. They had been advised to leave any time they heard unusual animal calls or sounds at night. That was a signal to them that they were no longer safe. The warning echoed in Elena's mind now, but it came too late. Another call rang out, this time closer. A cacophony of guttural sounds layered with the sharp screech of birds. The hair on the back of Elena's neck stood up, a primal fear rising within her. She glanced around at her team, their faces pale, eyes wide with growing dread. "We need to leave," Elena said, her voice firm but tinged with an urgency she hadn't intended. She knew it was too late to pack up and move before nightfall, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was stalking them from the shadows. "Leave?" Carlos repeated, his voice a mix of disbelief and fear. "It's dark, Elena. We can't stay here," she interrupted. "We've been warned, and the jungle isn't forgiving. We need to go before it gets worse." "But where will we go?" Maya, the youngest of the team, spoke up, her voice trembling. "We're too far out to make it back to base camp tonight, and it's not like we're going to find any safety out there. We'd be walking right into it." Elena hesitated, her mind racing for a solution. Her gut told her that moving might make them more vulnerable, but staying put felt even worse. She looked at the darkened jungle around them, the sense of being watched growing with every minute. The fear among her team was palpable. A rustling noise broke her thoughts, coming from the dense brush just beyond the camp's light. Elena stiffened, motioning for everyone to be quiet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained her ears, listening. The rustling grew louder, then stopped abruptly. "Stay low," Elena whispered. She grabbed her flashlight, flicking it on, but the beam of light barely penetrated the darkness. Her thoughts raced. Was it an animal? Or worse, was it a person, something, or someone, watching them from the depths of the jungle? Another screech broke through the night, closer this time. The call was unmistakable, a cry so human-like that it made Elena's blood run cold. It was followed by a rustling noise, not the quick, skittering movements of an animal, but something far heavier, deliberate, something larger, moving with a purpose. "Elena," Carlos whispered, his voice tight with fear. I think we're not alone." The fire crackled again, popping in the silence, but the sound only served to heighten the tension. Something out there was moving, watching them. Elena's grip on her machete tightened as she stood in place, waiting for whatever would come next. She could feel the sweat beginning to trickle down the back of her neck, her pulse quickening as the tension in the air thickened. The next morning, they left as planned, at first light, with a sense of urgency, but not without hesitation. No one spoke much as they packed their gear, the gravity of the situation hanging over them. The jungle, which had felt like an endless expanse of untamed wilderness before, now seemed like an oppressive maze, a maze with no exit. They had walked into it willingly, seeking knowledge, but now they were running for their lives, hoping to escape the unseen eyes that tracked their every move. The air was already thick with heat by the time they started their trek. The humidity clung to their clothes, making each step feel like wading through water. The path ahead was narrow, barely visible through the underbrush. Yet they followed it with an urgency that bordered on panic. Elena led the group, her senses on high alert. She kept looking over her shoulder, convinced that something was following them. As the day wore on, the feeling of being pursued only grew stronger. The forest seemed to close in around them, the canopy thick with tangled vines and leaves that blocked the sun. Every creaking branch, every distant bird call, every snap of a twig sent the team into a frenzied state, jumping and looking around nervously. The further they traveled, the more the jungle seemed to shift, becoming darker and more foreboding. Even the sound of birds and insects, which had been a constant presence in the jungle, grew quieter, as if the entire ecosystem had become unnervingly still. The only sounds were the distant calls of unknown creatures, and they were too close, too deliberate. They were being watched. By nightfall, the team found themselves at the edge of a small clearing. Exhausted and on edge, they hastily set up camp, knowing they couldn't afford to press on through the darkness. As the fire crackled, Elena's mind raced. They had made good progress on their hike back, but the fear that had gnawed at them since the previous night had not relented. If anything, it had grown stronger. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them from every corner of the clearing. The night had taken on a strange quality. Even the air felt different, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Then, as if on cue, the calls returned. This time there was no doubt in Elena's mind. Those weren't just animal calls. They were not from the jungle's usual inhabitants. They were deliberate, too organized, too rhythmic to be from any creature she had encountered before. It was as if the jungle itself was alive with something far darker, far more intelligent than the creatures that called it home. The calls circled them, echoing from different directions, each one growing closer with every passing minute. Elena's team huddled near the fire, their faces pale and tense. They had not spoken much since setting up camp, and now their fear was palpable. Every sound in the jungle seemed amplified in their minds, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig making them jump in terror. The night dragged on. The calls from the jungle grew louder, more persistent, and the feeling of being hunted became overwhelming. Elena could hear their breathing, shallow and rapid, and her heart pounded as the shadows of the jungle seemed to draw closer. The jungle seemed to close in around them, as if the very trees and vines were conspiring to prevent their escape. Elena led the team with a grim determination, her machete in hand as she hacked through the thick undergrowth. The air was oppressively humid. Each breath they took felt like a weight in their lungs, and the oppressive silence that had settled in the wake of the calls weighed heavily on their minds. It was as though the jungle itself had gone quiet, watching, waiting. With every step they took, they were keenly aware of the growing dread gnawing at their minds. The sense of being pursued had escalated. It wasn't just the distant calls anymore. It was the feeling of eyes upon them, following their every movement. There were no animal sounds now, only the occasional snap of a twig underfoot or the soft rustle of leaves, as if something unseen was moving just beyond the edges of their sight. Carlos was the first to voice his fear, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. "Elena, they're getting closer. I can feel it." His eyes darted nervously to the left and right, constantly scanning the shadows that seemed to reach toward them with sinister intent. Elena didn't respond at first, her own fear too tangled up with the instinct to survive. She had to keep them moving, to push through the jungle and get them to safety. They couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Not with the terror pressing in from all sides. "Keep moving," Elena urged, her voice low but firm. "We're close. We have to keep going." But the trek had become a nightmare. The ground uneven and treacherous as they moved deeper into the jungle. The once familiar path had become a blur of green, the trees thickening, and the foliage more oppressive with each step. It felt as if the forest itself were closing in on them, blocking their way out. Hours seemed to stretch on, each moment heavier than the last. They couldn't afford to rest, at least not until they reached a safer place. But each step only heightened their sense of vulnerability. Each crack of a branch, each whisper of wind in the trees, made them jump in terror. The whispers of the jungle became louder as they moved forward. Elena's eyes darted nervously to the darkened tree line, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that they were being watched. But no matter how hard she looked, she could see nothing but the shifting shadows, the constant presence of the jungle around them. As they pressed forward, Carlos stumbled, his leg catching on a tangled vine. He cursed under his breath, but it was more a reflexive reaction than an expression of actual pain. His mind was too consumed with terror to pay attention to the small injuries they all seemed to be collecting. Elena gave him a quick glance, but there was no time for sympathy now. "Elena, I don't think we can make it." Maya's voice was barely a whisper, thick with the exhaustion that had set into her bones. She had been silent for the most part, her pale face flushed with the feverish heat, but her voice now betrayed the desperation that had begun to take hold of her. "What if they catch us before we get out? What if we don't make it?" Elena wanted to reassure her, to offer some kind of comfort, but the truth was too grim. She couldn't promise them safety, not when the jungle felt so alive with an unseen presence. Every time she glanced over her shoulder, she felt the weight of eyes staring back at her. "They're out there," Carlos said, his voice low but steady. "They're hunting us." A low growl vibrated the air around them. The noise was unlike anything they had heard before, a deep, rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was a growl so primal, so otherworldly, that it sent a chill crawling up Elena's spine. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. What the hell was that? Maya gasped, her eyes wide with terror as she searched the jungle around them. Elena's hand tightened around her machete. She didn't know what that growl had been, but it wasn't an animal. No animal in the jungle made a sound like that. The growl was deliberate, a signal of something closer, something far more menacing. "We have to move faster," Elena said, her voice growing more urgent. "Now. They know where we are." The pace quickened, but it was becoming harder to maintain any semblance of order. They were scrambling now, trying to put as much distance between themselves and whatever was out there in the jungle, watching them, hunting them. Sweat streamed down Elena's face, stinging her eyes. But there was no time to stop. They had to keep moving. The night seemed to fall even more suddenly now, the jungle growing darker by the minute, the trees casting long, twisted shadows over the path. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faintest traces of light as the moon rose high above. Carlos stumbled again, but this time there was no time for him to recover. His voice was thick with panic. "Elena, I heard it again. Something's out there, closer. It's not—" The sound of twigs snapping underfoot interrupted him. Another growl echoed through the jungle, louder this time. The deep guttural noise vibrated through the ground beneath them. It was closer. Closer than it had ever been. "Elena!" Maya cried, her voice raw with fear. "We need to hide." The jungle seemed to swallow them whole. Every direction was dark, filled with tangled vines and thick underbrush. But there was no place to hide. They were exposed. The team had no choice but to keep moving, to keep pushing through the jungle, hoping, praying, that they could make it to safety before they were caught. But as the minutes passed, it felt more and more as if the jungle was actively pushing back against them. The trees seemed to move, their limbs reaching out like claws to block their way. The path they had been following grew ever more treacherous, with sharp rocks jutting up from the ground, and low-hanging branches threatening to snag them as they passed. Then, from deep in the jungle, they heard it. A scream that pierced the night with a blood-curdling shriek. It was a sound that chilled Elena to her core, a primal cry that was almost human, but twisted with terror. Maya screamed, her voice high and panicked, as she stumbled backward. "They're coming! We're going to die out here!" Carlos grabbed her arm, pulling her back toward him, his grip tight. "Number, stay with us. We can't—" But the scream echoed again, and this time it was closer, much closer. "Elena!" Carlos shouted, his voice trembling with raw panic. "They're here. We're running out of time." The growl came again, louder now. They could hear something moving in the trees, something large, something fast. Whatever it was getting closer. "We need to move, now," Elena commanded. They were no longer walking. They were running, each of them pushing themselves harder, faster, as the jungle seemed to come alive around them, branches reaching for them, shadows moving in the corner of their vision. But the sound of pursuit was unmistakable now. The rustling was growing louder, more intense, and as Elena pushed forward, she could see them in the shadows, figures moving swiftly, silently, through the trees. They were closing in. The tribe had found them,